At 58 minutes past midnight on the 10th of May, 1994, in a room at the end of a corridor in Crest Hill, Illinois, a doctor looked at a clock and said a time out loud, and a man who had killed 33 people was dead. It had taken longer than it was supposed to. The tubes had been run into his arms, and the first drug had gone in and put him to sleep, and then the second drug had refused to move. It had turned to jelly in the line. Somewhere between the machine and the man, the chemistry had failed, and for something between 10 and 20 minutes, the state of Illinois stood in a room with a sleeping killer and a blocked tube, and had to fix it while people watched through the glass. 2 men threw the switches. Nobody knows their names. Nobody has ever known their names. They were selected. They were paid. They were kept anonymous by law, and when it was finished, they went home to whatever their houses were, and they got up the next morning and went on with their lives, carrying the one thing that almost nobody in this country carries. This is not a film about John Wayne Gacy. You already know about John Wayne Gacy. There are 1,000 videos about John Wayne Gacy. What there is not, anywhere, is a film about the building he died in, and about the people who worked in it. Because Stateville Correctional Center was not a set for one man's ending. It was a workplace. For 99 years, it was the place where 939 people in Illinois went to earn a living, 676 of them in uniform, walking tiers in a round stone drum with a gun tower in the middle of it, watched by everyone they were watching. And in September of 2024, a federal judge ordered the last 430 prisoners out, and the state announced $900 million to knock it down. So this is the story of the strangest building in American corrections, the last roundhouse. A circle of cells around an armed tower, designed by an English philosopher who never saw a prison, opened in 1925 and finally emptied last year. It is the story of what was done inside it. The 432 men deliberately infected with malaria in 1944, in an experiment that a lot of people at the time called patriotic. It is the story of Richard Speck, who murdered 8 young women in one night in Chicago, and then died in this prison on the eve of his 50th birthday, and of the videotape that came out afterwards that made half the country want to dig him up. And yes, it is the story of the night in 1994 when the tube clogged. But mostly, it is the story of the people on the other side of the bars. The officers, the execution team, the families of the 8 nurses and the 33 boys who have spent their lives being told the killers' names and almost never hearing their own. We will name them. That is a promise, and it is the reason this channel exists. Every week we tell the stories of the American prisons and asylums that shaped how this country punished people, who worked inside them, and what happened when the doors finally closed for good. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins with an idea that came out of England more than a century before a single stone was laid in Illinois. In the 1790s, an English philosopher named Jeremy Bentham drew a building. He called it the panopticon, from the Greek, meaning all-seeing. The idea was very simple, and once you have heard it, very hard to forget. You build the cells in a ring. You put a guard tower in the middle. Every cell faces inward. Every man in every cell can be seen from the tower at any moment. And crucially, no man in any cell can ever tell whether he is being looked at right now or not. Bentham's argument was that this uncertainty would do the work. A prisoner who might be watched at any second eventually behaves as though he is being watched at every second. You would not need to beat him. You would not need very many staff. The architecture would do the discipline for you. Bentham spent years trying to get one built in England. He never did. He died in 1832, having never seen his own idea standing up in stone. Illinois built it. Construction began in August of 1916 on farmland north of Joliet, in what is now Crest Hill. The state already had a prison at Joliet, the Gothic limestone castle down the road that most people picture when they picture an Illinois prison, and it was overcrowded and it was old. Stateville was supposed to be the modern answer. It opened on the 9th of March, 1925, built for 1,506 men, and 4 of its cell houses were round. You have to stand in one to understand why that mattered. The roundhouse at Stateville was known officially as F House. Everyone who worked there called it the roundhouse. It went up in 1922, and it was a drum of stone and steel, and around the inside wall of that drum ran tiers of cells, stacked 4 high, every single one of them facing the center. In the middle of the floor stood a tower. In the tower stood an officer with a rifle. From that tower, you could see into every cell in the building without moving your feet. Now think about what that means from the tower's side, because that is the part nobody ever tells you. The design that lets one officer see 300 men also puts one officer in the middle of 300 men. There is nowhere to stand where you are not the center of the room. There is no corner. There is no back wall to put your shoulders against. Every man in that building, every hour of every shift, knows exactly where you are, what you are doing, and how long you have been doing it. Officers who worked F House described the noise first, always. A round stone room with a hard floor and hundreds of steel doors does not absorb sound. It multiplies it. Every drop tray, every shout, every slammed gate comes back off the curved wall and arrives from a direction that is not the direction it came from. Men who spent decades in there talk about the ringing. They talk about coming off shift and sitting in a car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before they could drive home, waiting for their ears to come back. Try to imagine that as a career. Not a bad week, not a hard year. 30 years of sound arriving from the wrong direction. And here's the thing Bentham never accounted for. Sitting at his desk in England in 1787, his design assumed the tower was safe. In practice, the tower is a fixed position in the middle of an open floor, and everybody in the building knows the schedule of the man inside it. F House was the last one. Other states built roundhouses. Other states knocked them down or converted them into something else. By the 1990s, the roundhouse at Stateville was the only panopticon cell house still operating anywhere in the United States of America. Men were still living inside an 18th century English thought experiment in Illinois in the age of the mobile telephone. It stayed open until the 30th of November, 2016, when the Illinois Department of Corrections moved the last 36 men out of it. The building still stands because it is historically significant, which is a sentence that means one thing to a preservationist and something completely different to a man who spent his working life inside it. Now let us talk about the ordinary day, because 99 years of a prison is not 99 years of famous murderers. It is 99 years of a shift. 4 times a day, in every American prison, everything stops, and every human being is accounted for. At Stateville, the count was the spine of the day. Officers walked the tiers and looked into every cell and confirmed a living body, and the numbers went to a central point. And if the numbers did not match, they were done again. And if they still did not match, the prison locked down and nobody moved, and nothing happened until the discrepancy resolved itself, one way or the other. That sounds administrative. It is not. A count is the moment a prison finds out whether it is still a prison. In the roundhouse, the count had a peculiar quality, because the officer could see almost all of it from the floor. He could stand in the middle of that stone drum and turn slowly and take in 300 cells at once. And then, he had to walk them anyway. Everyone. Because seeing a shape on a bunk is not the same as confirming a man. And the oldest trick in every prison in the world is a rolled blanket and a wig. Then there was the food. And I promise you, this is not a small point. Stateville, like most large American prisons of its era, ran on its own farm. There were fields. There was a dairy. There was a slaughterhouse. Inmates worked all of it. In the 1930s and 40s, the prison produced a meaningful proportion of what it ate. And Illinois liked that arrangement because it was cheap and because it kept men occupied. And every warden in America will give you the same sentence in the same words. An idle prison is a dangerous prison. The farm work was also the good job. In a place where the alternative was a cell, a man who got onto the farm detail was outside, in weather, doing something with a beginning and an end to it. Officers assigned to those details describe them as the easiest years of their careers, because men do not throw away the only thing they have that resembles freedom. When the farms went, and they went all across America through the 60s and 70s, on cost grounds and litigation grounds, and because agriculture consolidated, something went with them that nobody ever replaced. The men stayed inside. The days got longer. Every retired officer of a certain age will tell you that the trouble started when the work stopped. And while that is too simple to be the whole truth, it is not wrong either. Because the trouble came, and it came early. If you have spent any time on this channel, you already know the pattern. A prison opens, and there is a period of a few years when the administration believes the building will do the work, and then the building finds out what it is actually holding. Stateville had riots in the 1920s, and again in the 1930s, and they were not random. Illinois had changed its parole laws, and men who had come in expecting one number were now looking at a bigger one. Tension between prisoners and officers built for months. And then there was the incident the men called the Washington's Birthday Massacre, in which guards machine-gunned 3 prisoners during an escape attempt. Sit with the phrase machine-gunned for a second. This is a state penitentiary in the American Midwest, and the tool reached for is a machine gun, and the incident acquires a nickname, which means it happened often enough or vividly enough that the population needed a shorthand for it. The bad feeling from that ran straight into the riot. On the 18th of March, the men at Stateville rioted at scale and tried to set the prison on fire. And the reason given afterwards, this is the part that complicates it, was that they were trying to attract attention from outside, specifically on behalf of sick and dying men who had been refused parole. There is no clean side in that story. There are men trying to burn down a building. There are also men dying in cells who had been told no, and there are officers in the middle of it who did not write the parole law and did not deny anybody anything, holding a line inside a burning building on somebody else's policy. That is the actual shape of almost every prison disturbance in American history. And it is the shape that documentaries almost never draw, because it does not have a hero in it. If this is the kind of history you want, the version with the staff in it, and the paperwork, and the parole board, and not just the famous inmate, then hit the like button, because it genuinely does tell the algorithm to show this to the other people who want it. It costs you nothing. And it is the only reason a channel like this one can exist, right? 1944. The United States is fighting a war in the Pacific, and it is losing men to something that is not the Japanese army. It is losing them to malaria. Soldiers in the islands are going down in numbers that are frightening the War Department, and the drug the world had relied on, quinine, is largely cut off because the plantations that produced it are behind enemy lines. The country needs a new anti-malarial drug. It needs it quickly. And to test an anti-malarial drug, you need human beings who have malaria. In March of 1944, doctors from the University of Chicago came to Stateville Correctional Center and built a laboratory inside the prison. Over the course of the program, 432 Stateville prisoners were deliberately infected with a virulent strain of malaria by mosquito, and then treated with experimental compounds so that researchers could measure what worked, at what dose, and what it did to a man on the way through. It was part of the largest wartime malaria research effort in the country, running at Stateville, at the Federal Penitentiary in Atlanta, and at the New Jersey State Reformatory. Around 800 men in total. Here is the part that is genuinely difficult, and the reason we are not going to hand you an easy feeling. The men volunteered. They were asked. There were more volunteers than there were places. The program was covered admiringly in the national press as an example of American prisoners doing their bit. Men who had put themselves outside society, finding a way back into it. Life magazine ran photographs of it. The men who took part were, in the language of the time, patriots, and a number of them said so themselves, and they were also prisoners, in a building where the state controlled every hour of their day. where parole boards existed, where a note in a file could shorten a sentence by years, where a man who said yes to a doctor might very reasonably believe that the yes would be remembered when his date came up. Nobody promised them anything. That is what the record says, and the record is probably accurate. But a promise is not the only way to communicate a promise. That is the argument, and it has never been settled. After the war, when the Nuremberg trials examined what Nazi doctors had done, the defense raised American prison research, including Stateville, and the men who went on to write the Nuremberg Code had to think hard about Illinois. Decades later, ethicists went back through the records and split, and they are still split today. You will have an opinion about it. So will the person watching this next to you. That is the point, and that is why it is in this film. Now, the men. Nathan Leopold arrived at Stateville in 1931. If you do not know the name, in 1924, Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, two wealthy, extremely clever young men from the south side of Chicago, murdered a 14-year-old boy named Bobby Franks. They did it by their own account to prove that they were intelligent enough to commit a crime nobody could solve. They were not. Leopold dropped his spectacles at the scene, a pair with a hinge mechanism so unusual that only 3 had been sold in the entire city of Chicago. Bobby Franks was 14 years old. He was walking home from school. His father was a wealthy watch manufacturer, and the 2 killers were known to the family, and that is the only reason a careful boy got into a car. Say his name. Because for 100 years, this case has been filed under Leopold and Loeb, and the child has been the 3rd name in his own murder. Loeb did not last. On the 28th of January, 1936, in a washroom at Stateville, another inmate named James Day attacked Richard Loeb with a straight razor and cut him more than 50 times. Loeb died of it. Day's account was that Loeb had made a sexual advance and that he had defended himself. The state's evidence indicated the razor had been stolen weeks in advance and passed to Day before the killing, which is not what self-defense looks like. James Day went to trial in June of 1936, and he was acquitted. Read that again. A man killed the most notorious inmate in the state of Illinois inside a maximum security penitentiary with a weapon the evidence said had been obtained weeks earlier, and a jury let him go. That verdict tells you something true about 1936 that no statistic will. There were people in that state who thought the killing of Richard Loeb was not really a crime, and every officer at Stateville had to run a prison the following Monday in a building where the population had just been shown by a court that some inmates are worth less than others. Leopold stayed for another 22 years. He worked in the prison hospital. He volunteered for the malaria program and was infected along with the rest. He taught. He reorganized the prison library into a functioning system. He was paroled in 1958 after 33 years, moved to Puerto Rico, and died there in August of 1971. There is a version of that story told as redemption, and it gets told that way often. There is another version in which a young man of enormous privilege murdered a child for entertainment, and then spent 33 years being unusually good at exactly the things that get a man paroled. Both versions are fully supported by the record. Pick one or hold both, but do not let anybody tell you it is simple. Then, Richard Speck. On the night of the 13th of July, 1966, a man broke into a townhouse on East 100th Street on the south side of Chicago, where 9 student nurses lived together. He tied them up with strips of bedsheet. Then, over the course of several hours, he took them out of the room one at a time and murdered 8 of them. Their names were Gloria Davy, Patricia Matusek, Nina Jo Schmale, Pamela Wilkening, Suzanne Ferris, Marianne Jordan, Merlita Gargulo, Valentina Passion. 8 young women, most of them in their early 20s, all of them training to spend their lives looking after other people. The 9th was Corazon Amurao. She rolled under a bed in the dark and stayed there, silent, for hours, while it happened in the next room, and in the morning, she climbed out onto a window ledge and screamed until somebody came. She gave the description that caught him. She testified. In the courtroom, she was asked to identify the man. and she got up, and she walked across the floor of that court, and she pointed at him from a few feet away. And then she lived the rest of her life having done that. Speck was sentenced to death. Then the Supreme Court's 1972 decision on capital punishment took the sentence away, and he was resentenced to a term of years, and he went to Stateville. He died there on the 5th of December, 1991, of a heart attack, one day before his 50th birthday. Nobody claimed the body. That should have been the end of it. It was not. In May of 1996, the Chicago broadcaster Bill Curtis was handed a videotape by an attorney. It had been made secretly inside Stateville in December of 1988, 3 years before Speck died, and smuggled out. On that tape, Richard Speck is seen using drugs, with a substantial quantity of cash, and engaged in sexual activity inside a maximum security penitentiary, on camera. And he talks about the murders. Speck had said for 25 years that he could not remember that night. On the tape, he describes it. And asked about the 8 women, he says that it just wasn't their night. When that tape went out in Illinois, the reaction was not sorrow. It was fury, not at Speck. Speck had been dead for 5 years and was beyond anybody's reach. The fury went at the system, at a prison service in which a man could live like that for years inside the most secure building the state owned, while 8 families got up every morning and went to work. The legislature held hearings. The Attorney General opened an investigation. Corrections opened its own. Lawmakers in Springfield demanded an end to what they called a culture of complicity between staff and the state's 38,000 inmates. And here is the part that never gets said. Whatever a small number of people at Stateville did or allowed, several thousand men and women who worked in Illinois corrections and had nothing whatever to do with it spent the next 20 years being asked about that videotape at family barbecues. That is what a scandal does inside a workforce. It does not land on the guilty. It lands on the uniform. Before we get to the 10th of May, 1994, there is one more thing about this building that has to be said because it explains everything that came after it. From the late 1960s onward, the Chicago street organizations came into the Illinois prison system in numbers, and by the 70s, they were an organizing fact of daily life inside Stateville. Membership on the street continued inside. Discipline inside was enforced by the organization. Some cell houses, some of the time, ran on an understanding between the administration and the men who actually controlled the tier. Officers of that era describe a job in which the formal authority and the real authority were not the same thing, and the entire skill was knowing precisely where the line sat on any given morning. That is not corruption, whatever it looks like from the outside. That is a small number of unarmed people managing a very large number of people who have very little left to lose, in a building the state has never adequately staffed, where the alternative to negotiation is not order, it is blood. Illinois eventually broke the worst of it with a strategy that is now standard everywhere. Identify the leadership, separate it, ship it to segregation units at the other end of the state, and remove the organization's ability to hold a meeting. It worked. And the cost of it was that the units where those men ended up became something the American prison system had never had before, which makes Stateville the hinge of the whole story. It is the last building of the old idea that a prison should watch a man standing at the beginning of the new idea, which is that a prison should make sure no 2 men are ever in a room together at all. Bentham wanted a building where every man could be seen. What America built next was a building where no man is seen by anyone. If you are finding this useful, this is the point in the film where I would normally ask you to subscribe, and I am going to, because the next section is the one this whole channel exists for. We do not do these from the inmate's side. We do them from the side of the people who were still there in the morning, the officers, the town, the families of the victims. If that is the version of this history you have been looking for and could not find, subscribe and go back through the channel afterwards, because there are dozens of them. Now, the 10th of May, 1994. John Wayne Gacy murdered 33 young men and boys between 1972 and 1978. He buried 26 of them in the crawl space beneath his own house in Norwood Park Township, and when the crawl space was full, he put the others in the Des Plaines River. Several of them were never identified. For decades, they were numbers on a list. The Cook County Sheriff's Office reopened the identification effort in 2011, and one by one, using modern genetics, some of those numbers turned back into names. William Bundy, Jimmy Hackinson, Francis Wayne, Alexander. That's not a footnote. Those identifications happened because families never stopped filing, never stopped calling, never stopped keeping a bedroom the way it was in 1976. 30-odd families spent their entire adult lives on hold, and some of them died before the phone rang. Gacy spent 14 years under sentence of death. Most of it was at Menard, in the far south of the state. He was moved to Stateville for the end, because Stateville was where the state of Illinois carried out executions. The method had changed. Illinois had moved from the electric chair to lethal injection, and a room at Stateville had been fitted out for it. A gurney, restraints, and lines running through a wall into an adjoining room so that the men operating the machine could not be seen by the witnesses and could not see the man on the table die. 2 executioners, selected quietly, paid a fee, protected by statute from ever being publicly named. On the evening of the 9th of May, the prison filled up. Official witnesses, reporters chosen by lot. William Kunkel, the prosecutor who had convicted Gacy and who had stood in a courtroom with the diagram of that crawlspace, came to watch. Outside the walls, in the dark, several hundred people gathered, some with signs against the death penalty, a great many more without, and at least a few selling t-shirts. Shortly after midnight, they began. The first drug was sodium thiopental, and it did exactly what it was supposed to do. It put him to sleep. The second drug was pancuronium bromide, which paralyzes, and it did not move. Something in the chemistry or the tubing had failed, and the drug had thickened in the line. It would not flow, and so the execution stopped, with the man on the table asleep and alive, while the equipment was replaced. It took between 10 and 20 minutes. Think about the people inside that building for those minutes. The officers standing at the walls of a room where nothing was happening and everything was happening. The witnesses behind glass, who had arrived expecting something to take 4 minutes and were now well into the 12th. And the 2 anonymous men in the next room who had been briefed carefully on exactly how this would go and were now in a situation nobody had described to them. Then it was fixed. The third drug, potassium chloride, went in and stopped his heart. And at 58 minutes past midnight on the 10th of May, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was pronounced dead. Illinois investigated the malfunction afterwards and changed the equipment. His last words, as reported by the state's Director of Corrections, Howard Peters, were that taking his life would not compensate for the loss of the others, and that this was the state murdering him. The Will County coroner, Patrick O'Neill, witnessed the autopsy. We said at the start that this is a film about the people on the other side of the bars, and this is where that has to mean something instead of just sounding good. The 2 executioners went home. Whatever you believe about capital punishment, and the people watching this do not agree with each other about capital punishment, and that is entirely fine. There is a fact underneath the argument that both sides tend to walk straight past. Somebody has to do it. Not the governor who signs the warrant. Not the jury that votes for it. Not the public that supports it in an opinion poll. A person with a name and a family and a drive home has to stand in that room and move his hand. The state of Illinois protected the identity of those 2 men, and that was the right thing to do. It also meant that neither of them could ever talk about it. Not to a neighbor, not to a doctor, in most cases, not to a wife. A man who does the single hardest thing his state asks of anyone, and who is then legally unable to describe it to another human being, is carrying that entirely on his own. Corrections officers involved in executions describe the same cluster of things afterwards in state after state. Sleep that will not come, a short temper at home over nothing, and a specific kind of silence that the family learns not to walk into. Illinois executed 12 people after the death penalty returned in 1977. It has executed nobody since 1999. Here is why. And it did not happen because of a protest. Through the 1990s, a series of men on Illinois death row were shown to be innocent. Not released on a technicality, innocent. The wrong man, convicted, sentenced to die, and in some cases within days of it. Anthony Porter came within 2 days of execution. He was cleared in 1999 after a group of journalism students at Northwestern University, working on a class assignment, found the actual killer and obtained a confession on video. Students, a class project, 2 days. By the beginning of 2000, the state of Illinois had executed 12 people and had freed 13 from death row as wrongly convicted. Governor George Ryan was a Republican who had voted for capital punishment and campaigned on it. He looked at those two numbers, 12 executed, 13 exonerated, and on the 31st of January, 2000, he declared a moratorium, making Illinois the first state in America to stop executions voluntarily. He appointed a commission. It came back with 85 recommendations to reduce the chance of executing an innocent person. The legislature passed one of them. So in 2003, in effectively his final act as governor, Ryan emptied the row. He commuted the sentences of all 167 people on Illinois death row and pardoned 4 outright. In 2011, Illinois abolished capital punishment, and every one of those decisions was, at the end of the chain, about one room at Stateville, because Stateville is where it would have happened. Where you stand on that is your own business, and the comments underneath this video are going to contain both sides, and we are not going to tidy that up or pretend otherwise. There are people watching this who believe Anthony Porter's 2 days prove the whole thing has to stop. There are people watching this who believe John Wayne Gacy proves the opposite, that a system's failures elsewhere do not erase the cases where there is no doubt at all, and that 33 bodies, 26 of them under a man's own floor, is not a case with doubt in it. Both of those people are usually decent, and both usually assume the other one has not thought about it properly. It is worth having the argument with the actual facts in front of you, which is why we have laid them out rather than told you what to conclude. What we will say is this: whatever gets decided in a legislature lands, in the end, in one room, on the shoulders of a very small number of people whose names are protected by law. Any argument about the death penalty that never once mentions them is not a complete argument. And then, the building itself started to die. Stateville was 100 years old. The plumbing was 100 years old. Concrete that has taken a century of Illinois winters does what concrete does. It takes on water, it freezes, it opens. In the final years, conditions in parts of the prison were found by a court to be unfit for the people living in them, and that finding is what set the ending in motion. In March of 2024, Governor J.B. Pritzker announced a capital plan of $900 million to demolish Stateville and Logan Correctional Center and replace them with 2 new maximum security facilities of about 1,500 beds each. On the 9th of August, 2024, a federal judge, Andrea Wood, ordered most of the remaining 430 prisoners moved out by the 30th of September. And that is when the part of this story that nobody covered actually happened. Stateville employed 939 people. 676 of them were security staff. When the closure went before the legislature's Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability, the hearings filled up with union members. And when you read what they actually said, it is not quite what you would expect. Yes, they talked about jobs and transfers and commutes and pensions, but the thing they said again and again was about something else entirely. They did not want to be broken up. They had built something in that building over the years, a way of working together, a set of people who knew each other's tells, a crew that had been through things together. In a job where the person standing next to you is the specific reason you go home at the end of the shift, that is not sentimentality. That is the actual safety system. And a transfer list scatters it across a state. The prison closed. The last men were moved out in September of 2024. 939 working lives were rearranged. There was no ceremony for the officers. There is never a ceremony for the officers. Before we close this out, there are two more things that belong in any honest account of that building, and neither of them has a famous name attached to it. The first is what the job actually did to the people who did it. Corrections is one of a very small number of occupations in which a person spends their entire working life at a low, constant level of alertness that never fully switches off. Not fear. Officers will get annoyed if you call it fear, and they are right to. It is something narrower and stranger than that. A permanent, low-grade reading of the room. You learn, within about a year, to tell the difference between a man who is shouting and a man who is about to do something. Those two look almost identical to a visitor and nothing alike to somebody who has worked a tier. It cannot be taught in a classroom. Nobody has ever successfully written it down. The officers who pick it up quickly last a career, and the ones who do not tend to leave within 2 years. And everybody in the building knows which is which by about month 4. And you learn the second thing, which is much harder to say out loud. You spend more waking hours of your life with the men in those cells than you do with your own family. 20 years on a tier is 20 years of the same faces. You know which men get a visit, and which men have not had one since the 90s. You know whose mother died last spring. You know which man is about to have a bad week because his daughter's birthday is on Thursday, and he will not be phoning her. You are not their friend. Everybody on both sides of those bars understands that completely and permanently, and the moment an officer forgets it, he becomes a danger to everybody in the building, including himself. But it is still a relationship. It cannot not be. And when a man you have watched for 15 years dies in his cell on a Tuesday, something happens in an officer's chest, whether he wants it to or not, and then his shift continues. Because the count is at 4. Nobody prepares officers for that. There is no module on it, and no film about a prison has ever included it, because it is not dramatic. It is just true. The second thing is the town. Stateville sat between Crest Hill, Joliet, and Lockport, in a corner of Illinois, where the prison was never an abstraction. It was where people worked. Prison towns in America share a set of characteristics that outsiders consistently get wrong. People assume they are grim or ashamed or somehow stained by proximity. They are generally the opposite. They tend to be tight, unsentimental, and quietly proud because the work is genuinely difficult, and everybody in town knows it is difficult, and there is no need to explain your job to a neighbor who has done the same shift. The families follow each other in. A father in one cell house, a son in another, a daughter in the records office. It is one of the last genuinely inherited trades left in this country. It also comes with a cost that these towns do not discuss very much. Officers do not, as a rule, bring the day home, partly because there is a professional norm against it, and mostly because most of what happened is not something a person says at a kitchen table on a Wednesday. So, the families in a town like Crest Hill live for 30 years alongside a job they have never actually been told about. Wives and husbands of retired officers describe the same specific things. The sleep. Men who spent decades in a building where the entire craft of the job is noticing what is about to happen do not stop noticing when the uniform comes off. They sit facing the door in restaurants. They wake at shift change times for years after they have retired, for a job that no longer exists, in a building that is being demolished. If that is your father or your husband, you knew that paragraph before I finished it. And when a prison closes, that town does not simply lose an employer. It loses the thing the town was organized around. 939 jobs is not 939 jobs. It is the diner on the road out to the gate. It is the 2 shifts worth of cars that used to come through at 7 and at 3. It is the reason a particular petrol station stayed open at night. Nobody makes documentaries about that either. There is one more thread, and then we are done. The escapes. Stateville had a reputation from very early on, and it was earned. A modern building and a modern population turned out not to be the same problem, and the prison discovered that within a decade of opening, there were breaks, there were attempts, There was the ordinary category that never makes the newspapers, in which a man gets past two obstacles and is found in a cornfield at 4 in the morning, cold and finished, having discovered that rural Illinois in January is its own form of custody and does not require walls. And there was the category that produced the machine guns. You have to understand the era. American prisons in the 1920s and 30s were operating in the same country as the Prohibition gangs, and Illinois was the epicenter of that. The men arriving at Stateville were not, in a number of cases, isolated individuals. They had organizations outside with money, with vehicles, and with weapons. Escape from an Illinois penitentiary in 1930 was not necessarily a man alone with a spoon. It could be a coordinated operation with resources behind it. That is why the response looked the way it did, and it is why a nickname like the Washington's Birthday Massacre exists at all, none of which was decided by the men in the towers. Policy was set in Springfield. It was carried out on a wall in Crest Hill by somebody's neighbor who had a mortgage. Then, finally, the afterlife. Except that Stateville does not really have one yet, and that is what makes it different from almost every other institution on this channel. Alcatraz is a national park with more than 1 million visitors a year. The Ohio State Reformatory is a film location with a gift shop. Eastern State sells tickets. These places have had their second act as a spectacle. You can buy a ticket, walk a tier, take a photograph of a cell, and be back at your car in 90 minutes. Stateville will not get that. The state is knocking it down and building a working prison on the same ground. The roundhouse will stand because it is protected, but it will stand inside the perimeter of an operating maximum security facility, which means that in practical terms, almost nobody will ever see it again. It will be preserved and invisible at the same time. The last panopticon in America, kept and unvisitable. There is something almost too neat about that. A building designed on the principle that everyone inside it can be seen, ending its life as the one building nobody is allowed to look at. And the men and women who work there are scattered across the Illinois system now, in Pontiac and Menard and Dixon and Sheridan, doing the same job in a different building, with people they have not worked with before. So what is Stateville at the end? It is a building that took an English philosopher's idea about the power of being watched, an idea from 1787, drawn by a man who never built a prison in his life, and ran it in stone for 99 years. And in running it, it proved something Bentham never intended to prove, that a design which makes every man visible makes the watchman visible too. It is a building that infected 432 men with malaria during a war, with their consent, in a program that half the ethicists in the world now call indefensible, and the other half are still arguing about. It is a place where Nathan Leopold reorganized a library for 33 years, while a boy named Bobby Franks stayed 14 years old forever. It is where Richard Loeb was cut more than 50 times in a washroom, and the man who did it walked out of a courtroom free. It is where Richard Speck died alone and unclaimed, and where, 5 years later, the state found out how he had been living, and the anger about that landed on thousands of people who had nothing to do with it. It is the room where the state of Illinois killed John Wayne Gacy at 58 minutes past midnight, badly, while two men whose names will never be known did the actual work. And it is 939 people's workplace, closed last year, with a $900 million replacement going up on the same ground. If you drive out to Crest Hill today, the roundhouse is still there. It is protected. They will build the new prison around the fact of it, because it is historically significant. The last panopticon in America, an idea from 1787 standing in an Illinois field. Somebody will eventually put up a plaque. The plaque will say when it was built, and who designed it, and quite possibly who died in it. It will not say who worked in it. That is what we do here. That is the entire reason this channel exists. So, if you worked at Stateville, or your father did, or your husband did, tell us in the comments. Which cell house, and which years? If you grew up in Crest Hill, or Joliet, or Lockport, and the prison was simply the place the adults went in the morning, tell us that too. Those are the only accounts of that building that will ever exist because nobody was writing them down, and the people who have them are getting older every year. And if you knew one of the 8 nurses, or one of the 33, we will read every one of those comments, and we will not shorten them. Gloria Davy, Patricia Matusek, Nina Jo Schmale, Pamela Wilkening, Suzanne Ferris, Marianne Jordan, Merlita Gargullo, Valentina Passion, Bobby Franks. Say the names. That is the whole job. If this is your kind of history, go back through the channel. There are a lot of these, and the next one is already coming. I will see you in the next one.